Today, she will speak to us about linguistic production and perception in heritage language. This talk is co-sponsored by the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program and the Department of Romance Studies, and I would like to thank them for their support. Now, please help me to welcome Dr. Silva.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kramer. Slight change in the title, perception and production were reversed. And I thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. Thanks are due to Mary Goodrow, without whom I wouldn't be here because she arranged a lot. Sam Lupowitz, without whom I understand none of this would happen. Everyone at the Language Center, thank you so much. And especially all of you who are here. Big heart, thank you, thank you. And if there's anybody on Zoom, thank you too. So this is a slight modification of something that I learned from Diego Pasquale Cavo in a recent presentation that I saw by him, in which he projected a slide with puppies. And after that, everybody had to love his presentation. I adapted it a bit, and I'm using my nieces, Carminho on the left, whose mother is here, and Mabel on the right. So everybody now just has to love me. Sorry. I'm showing cute puppies. Exactly. With that, thank you very much. But before we leave, this is just an overview of what we're going to do. I'm not going to delay here because we have more important things. Well, it's not such a nice day today as it was yesterday, but still. Daylight savings, right? We could enjoy outside. So let's just recap what heritage language what heritage language is, and also what heritage language learners or speakers are. So first of all, heritage language, it's neither first, not in order of acquisition, because in order of acquisition it might be, but it's not what we think of normally as first language, nor is it a foreign language. Instead, it really has characteristics, features of both. And yet it also has features that neither monolinguals show, not foreign language learners show. So that. And Valdez, I keep repeating this little chart, this little graph from Valdez's work, Guadalupe Valdez being the queen of heritage language. She has so much to teach us. But she has this continuum, and a heritage speaker or learner might be anywhere in that continuum between A and B. Right? And you will find even more levels. And that's just a little representation of how they grow up with two or sometimes more languages. So perception and production. Let's talk a little about perceptions about bilingualism. This is work by Byram and colleagues that came out in 2021. And they looked at three groups: researchers, educators, and heritage speakers, in their case, Spanish specifically. And these are general statements about general perceptions on bilingualism, right? And there isn't a lot of difference in these statements, except for the first one. True bilingual speaks both languages equally well, And we see that the heritage speakers agree more with that statement than do researchers and educators, right? In terms of attitudes, however, we find something slightly different. So for statements 11 and 12, 11, it is crucial to improve grammar to sound like a native speaker. 12, the goal of heritage language education is to speak solely in the heritage language. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference there. And what the authors, suggest is that the fact that they don't agree with these statements, they don't agree heavily at least, suggests a rejection of normative views of language, right? On the other hand, for the other three statements, 8, the needs of heritage speakers are different from L2 learners. 9, switching is a compensatory strategy for lack of HL knowledge. And 10, it is important to promote heritage language bilingualism. We do find significant, as in statistically significant, differences among the groups. So in 10, for example, we see that bilinguals themselves value promotion less than the other two groups. Let's turn our attention to statement 9. Switching is a compensatory strategy. And we see that now it's the educators who agree with that. So it looks like educators still have a somewhat traditional, normative, conservative view of what code switching really is, because research in the past several years has shown that it is all but a compensatory strategy. It actually shows very complex levels of understanding how both languages work when people code switch. Not to mention that code switching also happens for social reasons, for communication reasons, right? So educators seem to be a little more conservative in that respect than both researchers and bilinguals themselves. In terms of still Byram and colleagues' study, in terms of evaluating their own linguistic competence, the bilinguals, the heritage speakers, tended to classify their own language in binary terms. It's either good or bad. Theirs tended to be bad. And they did refer to the heritage language sometimes as a second language. Again, going back to the idea not so much of order of acquisition, but rather what we understand as first being dominant, right? So second language is non-dominant. They also see that their heritage language as broken, as slang, as terrible. Interesting. Coincidentally, one of my graduate students is looking at perceptions of heritage learners of Portuguese, and his data suggests exactly the same thing, that learners see what they speak, not only what they speak, what their families speak as slang, as broken. As a matter of fact, the first part of his title I would translate as "We speak badly." Right? It's the first part is in Portuguese. and then he writes in English. He, being himself a heritage speaker of European Portuguese. But I only bring that up to show that it isn't particular to this group that they looked at, but it does seem to be a more widespread view of language that heritage speakers have. Now, I want to then bring to you a few things that I've done with Portuguese grammar to see if these perceptions hold any water, right? But before I do, and I wanted to start with the future subjunctive. Sorry about the mini lesson on the future subjunctive, but this is a verb form that only Portuguese, maybe Galician it still has. I'm not sure. Does Galician still have it? Okay, Galician. And old Spanish that people don't use anymore. So this is used, the future subjunctive, for hypotheses about the future, right? And if you use the present indicative, which in English you would, if you see my first example, in bold is the future subjunctive. And when you translate to English, that's when I am, right? But in Portuguese, you need the future subjunctive if you're talking about the future, right? So when I am in Lisbon, I will go to the castle. That first part, the when I am, future subjunctive. But if you use the present indicative as you would have in English, then it means that it's a habit. It's something you do normally. So suppose every time you go to Lisbon, because you love Lisbon, right? And what is there not to love about Lisbon? We all do. You go to the castle, and you go to Lisbon 3 times a year, lucky you. And every time you're there, you climb the castle. Let me tell you, climb it, because your legs will be in perfect shape. And every time you go, that's what happens if you use the present indicative. So Luis Amaral, Flavia Cunha, and myself looked at the conditions that require the use of the future subjunctive, right? And that forbid the use of the present indicative. Our participants were adult learners of Portuguese as a heritage language, and also as a foreign language. So you have the orange heritage and the green foreign language learners. And the control group were native speakers, if I remember correctly, about 8 or 9 of them. So the difference between the two groups of learners, the orange and the green, is not statistically significant. But the difference between the native speakers and the heritage learners is statistically significant, right? So might they be right? Might their language actually be bad or broken or terrible? Not so fast. Hold on, hold your horses there. So I looked at the difference between the accuracy in production of the predicate, what is known as the predicate and the imperfect. Mini lesson for those who are not familiar with Romance languages. This at least is in all Romance, not just Portuguese. But we have 2 simple pasts, right? And I'll leave it at that. And there are different conditions for the use of these simple pasts. And this was a group of high intermediate learners, I would say, 3rd year. And they had to write and talk about, there was a certain narrative that they had to do, right? So why a narrative of an event that they chose in the past, because that would elicit a lot of past tense usage, right? And we see that their accuracy is fairly high, up to almost 100% for the predicate in written, not that far for, I'm sorry, for the imperfect in written, not that far for the oral production, and quite high for the predicate as well. So I don't know that they're that right about thinking that their language is horrible or terrible. This is essentially the same idea, except this was a study I did with second semester and only heritage, well, the others were too, only heritage learners, never mind. So these were heritage learners. I was looking at whether explicit grammar instruction made a big difference in their language production. So I used both. So this is a very controlled data sort of thing. I used fill in the blanks, text, where they would have to fill in the blanks with either one, and also situations where they would have to pick which form reflected the situation. And well, as it turns out, instruction, or at least formal instruction, explicit, formal, traditional instruction. I was not the instructor, so I have to assume that the instruction was more in those lines, because we had talked and she had said to me, this is what I'm going to do. I'm like, okay, cool. That's traditional enough. Doesn't seem to help very much. But my point really is, even in second semester, their accuracy in those verb forms is not bad at all. Now, grammatical gender. This goes beyond Romance. Although all Romance languages have grammatical gender, binary grammatical gender, you get to German and you have 3 genders. German is my revenge. Every time anybody complains about German, well, about Portuguese, be happy that you're not studying German, right? You only have to contend with 2. Those guys have 3. Right. So at least that. So this is a study that we did. This had controlled data, second semester controlled data. And again, we see 3 groups now. We don't have a control. What we have is in blue, Spanish speakers learning Portuguese, in orange, heritage learners, and in green, foreign language learners. And we go 70%, 70%, 62, 66.2, even the monolinguals who only spoke English had a high accuracy. I consider over 50%, not bad, right, for second semester. Later, Cristiane Soares and I looked at a semi-controlled writing activity. So there was a prompt, right? But it wasn't fill in the blanks or anything like that. And we see not much problem either with gender. It seems that we think that grammatical gender, that learners make horrible mistakes with grammatical gender. Cristiane and I suppose, we can't prove, but we hypothesize that our impression is due to the prominence of gender, because every noun has a gender. Every single noun has a gender. And then you have to have agreement with the article, you have to have agreement with the adjective. There's a lot of gender going on. And when somebody gets it wrong, we'll go, oh my God, that was horrible. But, right, 95% among heritage learners, and foreign language learners, 91.8. I would say that's not bad, right? Not bad at all. So I don't know. I don't know that the bilinguals should be classifying their language so badly. I'm going to do a little detour here. Stop grammar for a second and connect my work with Dr. Knisley's work, who spoke to you last month, correct? A fantastic, fantastic researcher on non-binary language. I highly recommend that you read his work. And my research with Cristiane Soares on grammatical gender did evolve to non-binary language, so it went beyond grammar, right? And we edited that little book that Dr. Kramer referred to earlier. And we are currently investigating attitudes towards non-binary language among learners of Portuguese with both a survey and an interview. We haven't done the survey widespread, like to classes yet, only to select speakers that we have interviewed. And by plural, I mean two. I've done one, she has done another. I am going to interview a third one, but we're getting there. So my interview with a heritage learner who identifies as non-binary, in English, they identify as they, them, right? But in Portuguese, this speaker is okay being identified as feminine, right? One of the things that the learner said to me was, well, I wasn't aware that there was an option for Portuguese until a few months ago. So I'm still getting familiarized with those forms in Portuguese. It's a process, right? Another thing that came up is that the use of non-binary language, even in English, well, especially in English in their case, because they didn't even know about Portuguese, does depend on who the speaker is interacting with. This is something that we expect will be the case for other participants as well, right? So that was my little detour. Back to grammar. What explains what's going on, right? Why is the future subjunctive more iffy than other structures? Well, as it turns out, certain structures are indeed more complex. They may be complex in monolingual acquisition, even if you're only learning one language. Some structures are learned later than others, right? As it turns out, the subjunctive, in general, it is one, less productive. It shows up less in language than indicative mood, and therefore less exposure to the mood, even in L1. Imagine in L2. If I stand corrected, I correct myself, in heritage language. If even in rich monolingual contexts, one gets less subjunctive, in heritage language where the exposure is restricted, it's constrained mostly to the family, perhaps to classes, right? Depending on the learner may want to listen to music and this and that, but many don't in the heritage language, I mean. So there may be something there. Also, literacy skills, amount of formal study do make a difference, especially for complex structures. And we are going to take a look at those studies, and they're not mine, at this point. So Torregrossa, Flores and Rinke. Well, Rinke, I guess would be the right pronunciation, or closer to German, because it is Rinke, something like that. Anywho, back to their study. So they looked at less complex and more complex structures. And the red is the less complex and the blue is the more complex structures. And this is a predicted probability of a correct answer as a function of the amount of instruction in Portuguese across the two levels of difficulty. So an increase in the amount of instruction, more instruction, right? To your right there, leads to an increase in the probability of an accurate answer. Small detour, but still in grammar. Small detour to Russian, because this is relevant. A study with Russian heritage language learners, right? The authors looked at the impact of Russian lesson attendance on language proficiency scores and found that the higher the attendance, the more positive, the higher the scores were, right? However, they also emphasize that other influential factors, it's not just instruction that influences the results. They call attention to other factors, including, we'll get there. I thought my next slide was on including, so suspend that thought. This does look at Portuguese. And I wanted to show this because it's also about complexity, right? The figure looks at 3 different levels of complexity. So bilinguals at the top, monolinguals at the bottom, target structure on the left, target structure plus grammaticality on the right. And the higher the complexity, even for monolinguals, the less accurate they are. Yes, for monolinguals, true, the difference isn't huge, but still, their point is that complex structures are more complex. They're acquired later, right? And that might very well explain what we saw in the beginning with the subjunctive. And now you can unsuspend. So among the other factors is input, the role of input. And this comes from Correa and Flores. And what we see, if we look at home input, as in what they're getting, output, what they're producing, and European Portuguese speaking parents, right? And I highlighted that, they didn't. And those are the most relevant factors in their study for accuracy among heritage speakers, learners of European Portuguese. So back to the study on levels of complexity. This figure illustrates the predicted probabilities of an accurate answer for target structure and grammaticality, right? And what they show is heritage language richness of input. What kinds of input are children in their case, exposed to, right? And that richness leads to an increase in the probability of observing a correct response. So, to sum up, The richer the input, the higher the probability of accuracy. Again, subjunctive. There is an order of acquisition. I've talked about that, right? And some subjunctive contexts are acquired very late. This study also looked at European Portuguese. My studies will always have, or have so far, had participants that speak both European and Brazilian Portuguese as a heritage language, although mostly European. Correia, Flores, Rinke, they're always looking at European Portuguese, right? So children who had two first-generation parents and older siblings that used Portuguese with them at home would acquire mood choice. Is it the subjunctive? Is it the indicative? More competently, right? Than households where the dominant, so societally dominant language was more used, even if not exclusively. What about the language classroom? Why did I do any animation there? We know that foreign language learners and heritage learners have different needs. I'm not going to get into the details of that. I will say that Claudia Parodi claims, and I cannot disagree, that foreign language learners go from grammar to language, whereas heritage learners do the opposite. They go from the language to figure out the grammar, okay? Do I want, nope, that's fine. So our reality in terms of instruction is that mostly we have both heritage and foreign language learners in the same classroom, especially at the university level. At the high school level, you'd have to go to community schools in this country to find only heritage learners, right? So mostly we have mixed classrooms. And what can we do? Well, we can differentiate instruction, and I will refer you to Tomlinson for her original work on differentiation, to Maria Carreira's work. She talks a lot about differentiating. It isn't, keeping in mind that differentiation isn't individualized instruction and all that good stuff. Carreira also, the figure on the bottom with the two triangles, refer to Carreira's 2016 work, where she talks about macro-based versus micro-based teaching for heritage learners and foreign language learners. I do refer you to that. And finally, I wanted to call attention to Diego Pascual y Cabo's work on instruction, both with Josh Prada and also with one of his former advisees, where they propose the use of, and I adapted, for them it's RSTL, redefining Spanish teaching and learning, and I'm using RLT, redefining language teaching and learning, right? And what they argue is that the current model for mixed classrooms is to privilege foreign language instruction because we've been trained in foreign language instruction. That's what we know how to do, and this and that and the other. And what they argue is that we should flip that and use, they work with Spanish, I know, so bear with me here, that we should use the US communities that speak that language. And then you might very well ask, what happens for those of us who may have a heritage learner or two or three, but we don't have a large community of that language, right? they themselves suggest the use of current technologies to bring the communities to the learners, right? And that would, and that's what the 2020 study does show with good data, that that approach motivates everybody, not just the heritage learners, but also the foreign language learners. Not only does it open up everybody's horizons to realities that surround them, but motivates everybody much more than your traditional foreign language approach, right? So to sum up, I really am finishing. Structures are acquired at different ages. So some structures for heritage learners, given reduced input, may develop even later than they do in monolinguals. With varied input and instruction, heritage learners may approach monolingual speakers, but I do want to emphasize that monolingual, it should not be our goal, right? Heritage learners can and should not only maintain, but develop their language, but they don't, and they shouldn't have to speak like a monolingual. They are bilinguals, at least bi. They might be tri, they might be multi, but they are at least bilinguals. Let them be bilinguals, right? Let them code switch. They do that. What we can do, suggestion by Guadalupe Valdez way back when, by dialectalism, we can and we should value their contributions and their variety of the language, while at the same time helping them acquire a different register. They can acquire academic register, an academic register of the language, for example, a professional register of their heritage language, while at the same time not abandoning their family register, because they want to go back to their families and not be seen as different as whatever, right? Access to different contexts, and finally, consider the needs of heritage language learners when you have mixed classrooms. Thank you so much. I'm sorry it took so long.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. At this point, we would like to open the floor for any questions. If anybody is online, please raise your hand, but we will start with Mijong.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I really agree that, I'm teaching heritage Korean students as well. And then their perception about their language proficiency is really, I don't know if I want to say terrible, but they think they're bad,
Right.
But you mentioned that the heritage language learners' goal should not be the L1. But could you elaborate what the goal should be then? Because we are just training them to be just like native speakers.
We are.
Yeah.
Yes.
So then, if it is not that, then what we should do?
Thank you for that question. First of all, their contributions are insightful. They are in Korean, right? It might not be your Korean as a native speaker, but it is Korean. If you pay close attention, it follows the rules of Korean. It might show contact with English, but it is still Korean. It's just a variety of Korean, right? It's heritage Korean. So first of all, value that, value their contributions. as I was saying, quoting Valdez, it's not that we want to turn them into monolinguals. We don't. We want them to remain bilinguals, but we can show them and encourage them to add a register. And that's the idea of bidialectalism. Instead of substituting, adding. Right? We don't want them to forget what they know. We want them to add to what they know. Does that answer your question, or not completely?
Then can you give some examples of on how to do like a lesson plans?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. I will give an example that I used when we unfortunately don't anymore have introductory level classes for heritage learners of Portuguese. But one activity that I did, among others, I don't know why I remember that one, perhaps because Teresa and I looked at that. We never did publish that, my dear. That's why I remember. But we looked at, I did in the classroom, and we looked at the data. Different situations. We had them work in the classroom on different situations. So I don't remember. I remember we had going to the doctor, speaking with a professor. Do you remember what else? There was something in the family. Speaking in the class was that with the professor and with a peer? Right, right. So when they would for example, speak with a peer, they could use the forms that they are used to. It's fine. They'll understand each other. They can code switch, right? And we did specify, oh, you're in Portugal and you're doing this, right? Well, when they're in Portugal, if they code switch, the other person is not going to understand. So they need to stay in Portuguese, right? And if they're speaking to a professor in Portugal, they need to use a certain register that they are not used to, but they're learning about it in the classroom. So that kind of activity, does that help a bit?
Sorry, just related to that. I don't know which graphs is that, but you show that the students' proficiency when they were doing like a textbook compared to the situations.
Oh,
I see that like after like a learning the situation parts. Oh yeah, their profit accuracy is lowered.
right.
Right, after post-test.
Right.
So that situations are that you just mentioned, kind of
Something
things?
like that. This was a study I did. Text is really not textbook. It was a paragraph that they had to fill in the blanks. The situations, something like that. And what I did was I had a situation, somebody is at this and that and the other and doing whatever. It wasn't an activity. This was a study. So it's not the same type of situation that I was referring to. Here I was giving them a situation and then giving them two different sets of sentences, one with one verb form, the other with another verb form. And they would have to choose according with the situation, they would have to choose the verb form. So this is more verb form. This is more like grammar as opposed to context, right?
Can I jump in?
Please do.
Do you consider bilingualism in this case the community language, the L1, and the heritage language?
The community language is the baseline.
Because I think a lot of the questions might be connected to that, what is the language in community and what is the role in this situation?
So right. L1 is monolingual production, right? As you were saying, we teach them as if we wanted them to imitate monolinguals, right? But they come with something, and that's the community language, what their parents or perhaps grandparents produce is their baseline. It's where they're coming from. If we get them to produce what the parents and the grandparents produce, super great, right? And if we get to, and I shouldn't do that gesture, if we also get them to add academic or professional register, even greater, even more beautiful. But what we don't want to do is say that or substitute that baseline with the monolingual norm, because socially their language plays a role, right? The forms that they use, the code switching, how they talk among themselves with their relatives in the community, all of that, right? Their language is important for those functions, and they cannot substitute. They can add, but they can't substitute. So working with contexts, different contexts of language use, helps them see that what they already produce is valued and valuable, because it is valuable in certain contexts. But there's also forms and registers that are valuable for other contexts. Thank you. Yes.
Oh, it's okay.
Oh, for the Zoom.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I think one thing that I was thinking about was the role of the dialect, right? And so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about that in your research in terms of the foreign language learners and then the heritage learners, especially as it relates to accuracy, but also just in general, if people feel like maybe their dialect is something different than the language that, you know, they'd be learning in the classroom, and if that.
Thank you for that question. As a matter of fact, yes, they do feel that it is different. There does seem to be this general thought, as I mentioned my PhD students' research, that they seem to believe that they are in the classroom to learn to talk like people in Portugal do, right? So there is that expectation. You are right. And how that relates to accuracy, it really does depend on the structure when it comes to grammar, right? To grammatical structure, it really does depend, because some are acquired so early, even, well, for monolinguals, yes, that even bilinguals don't have much trouble with it. Some are acquired so late that because of the input that isn't very rich, they may even not acquire it, who knows? But they do expect that. And I never, that's one thing that just occurred to me listening to now that you threw that question. I never asked students if they were surprised by our approach that valued, now there's something you can do that is by an approach that values their contributions, that values their language. So food for thought. We should be asking that. Thank you. It is almost 6.
It sure is. Do we have any other questions here in the live audience or maybe on Zoom? Okay. Wonderful. Well, everybody, please help me thank Dr. Silva for her insightful
Thank
presentation.
you so much.
Have a wonderful evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. You guys are the best.